The snowstorm had arrived faster than expected, swallowing the narrow mountain road in a swirling sea of white. Claire gripped the steering wheel of her old hatchback, squinting through the frosted windshield as she followed the faint tire tracks of some long-forgotten traveler. She was miles away from civilization, her phone had no signal, and every direction she looked was an endless expanse of snow and sky. But she wasn't turning back. Not now. Up ahead, the jagged silhouette of Blackridge Orphanage emerged from the storm, a hulking Gothic structure with narrow windows and a tall, pointed roof. Its stone walls were draped in frost, and the iron gate at the entrance creaked faintly in the wind. Claire parked her car near the gate and stepped out into the freezing cold, pulling her scarf tightly around her neck. The wind howled like a living thing, whispering faint words that she couldn't quite make out. "Blackridge," she said under her breath, staring up at the building. "Let's see what secrets you've been keeping." The orphanage was even larger up close. Its dark stone walls loomed over her as she pushed open the heavy iron gate and stepped into the snow-covered courtyard. Statues of cherubs, weathered and cracked, stood frozen in poses of innocence, their hollow eyes staring blankly into the storm. Claire climbed the wide stone steps and pushed open the heavy wooden doors. They groaned in protest before swinging inward, revealing the cavernous entrance hall beyond. The air inside was freezing, the faint scent of mildew and dust clinging to every surface. Light filtered through stained glass windows, painting the floor in fractured patterns of color. Claire set down her backpack and retrieved her flashlight. The beam cut through the gloom, revealing long hallways stretching into darkness, grand staircases covered in dust, and faded portraits staring down from the walls. Somewhere deep within the building, she thought she heard faint laughter, soft, distant, and childlike. "Hello?" Claire called out, her voice echoing through the empty halls. No response. But she could feel it, the weight of something unseen, watching, waiting. Claire made her way through the orphanage, her boots leaving faint prints in the thick layer of dust that coated the floors. The building was a labyrinth of narrow hallways, crumbling staircases and locked doors. Every corner felt colder than the last, and the faint whispers, like children giggling just out of sight, followed her wherever she went. In one of the larger rooms, she found what had once been a playroom. Broken toys lay scattered across the floor, wooden trains, headless dolls, and faded picture books. A rocking horse stood in one corner, its wooden eyes staring blankly ahead. Claire knelt beside an old teddy bear, its fur matted and its button eyes missing. "What happened to you?" she whispered. A faint sound made her freeze. Tap, tap, tap. It came from behind her, slow and deliberate, like someone tapping on glass. She turned, her flashlight sweeping across the room, landing on a window partially covered by frost. And there, on the other side of the glass, was a face. It was small, pale, and childlike, with wide, hollow eyes that stared directly at her. Claire stumbled back, her heart hammering in her chest. But when she looked again, the face was gone, and the snowstorm outside pressed against the glass like a heavy curtain. Claire retreated to what had once been the orphanage's library, a grand room filled with towering shelves and dusty books. She started searching through the archives, her flashlight trembling in her hand. Old ledgers, names, records of children who had lived and died within these walls. One name appeared again and again. Eleanor Gray, listed as the matron of Blackridge Orphanage. There were scattered notes in the margins. Eleanor insisted on keeping the children isolated during the final winter. The sickness spread quickly. The children grew weaker, and Eleanor refused to let anyone leave. "They're still here. I can hear them at night." Claire's stomach turned. Whatever had happened here, it had been violent. Final. A loud bang echoed from somewhere upstairs, followed by the unmistakable sound of a child's voice. "Miss, are you lost?" Claire froze, her flashlight beam trembling as she aimed it at the library door. "Hello?" she called out, her voice breaking. "Come find us, Miss Claire." The voice was small, fragile, and impossibly clear. Claire's breath caught. How do you know my name? But the voice was gone, leaving only silence behind. Determined to uncover the truth, Claire made her way toward the upper floors. The grand staircase creaked under her weight, and shadows danced across the faded wallpaper as her flashlight flickered. At the end of a long hallway, she found a locked door. The plaque above it read, Matron's Office. Using a rusty key she'd found earlier in a desk drawer, Claire turned the lock. The door swung inward with a sharp creak. The office was small and cluttered, papers and ledgers scattered across the desk. A portrait of a stern-looking woman hung on the wall, her gaze sharp and cold. Eleanor Gray. On the desk lay an open journal, its final entry smeared and frantic. The sickness took them one by one. The snow wouldn't stop falling, and no one came to save us. I heard their voices in the dark. They said they weren't alone anymore. They said they had found someone else to look after them. But they aren't children anymore. There's something else. Claire's hand shook as she closed the journal. The shadows in the corner of the room seemed to shift, and she realized she wasn't alone. A soft giggle echoed from the darkness, followed by a childlike voice. Miss Claire, will you stay with us? Claire froze, the journal trembling in her hands. The faint giggle still echoed in the corners of the room, fading into the heavy silence. The shadows in the corners felt alive, shifting just beyond the reach of her flashlight. Who's there? She whispered, her voice cracking. No response. She backed away from the desk, her flashlight sweeping the corners of the matron's office. The faded wallpaper seemed to writhe in the weak light, and the face of Eleanor Gray stared down at her from the cracked portrait on the wall, her eyes hollow and accusing. Then Claire noticed something, a faint scratching sound coming from behind the bookshelf. Scratch, scratch, scratch. She approached slowly, her boots barely making a sound on the dusty floor. Pressing her ear against the faded wood, she could hear it. Soft breathing, faint whispers. Help us. Don't leave us. Claire pulled the bookshelf forward with a grunt, and it scraped against the wooden floor, revealing a narrow doorway carved into the stone wall. A faint, flickering light shone from somewhere deep within. Her gut told her to turn back, but her curiosity pulled her forward. The passage behind the bookshelf was cramped and freezing, the stone walls slick with frost. Claire's breath fogged in the narrow space as she descended a steep set of stone steps, her flashlight casting jittery shadows on the walls. At the bottom of the stairs, she stepped into a small, circular room. Rows of tiny beds lined the stone floor, each covered in thin, threadbare blankets. Toys, rusty tin soldiers, cracked porcelain dolls, wooden alphabet blocks, were scattered across the floor, coated in dust and frost. But it wasn't the toys that caught Claire's attention. It was the faint figures sitting on the beds. Children, pale, unmoving, their hollow eyes staring directly at her. Their skin was translucent, almost bluish, and frost clung to their thin nightgowns. Claire's chest tightened. Oh my God! The children didn't move, didn't blink. But one of them, a girl with a thin braid and a tattered teddy bear, raised her head ever so slightly. Are you here to save us, Miss Claire? The girl asked softly. Claire's voice trembled. What happened to you? They said we had to stay, the girl whispered. Matron said the snow wouldn't stop, that the sickness would take us if we left. One of the other children, a boy clutching a wooden train, spoke up. She promised to keep us safe. But then she locked the doors. She left us here in the dark. Claire's knees buckled, and she leaned against the cold stone wall. You were trapped down here. The girl with the teddy bear nodded, her hollow eyes fixed on Claire. But we're still here, and Matron still watches us. A loud bang echoed from upstairs, followed by heavy, deliberate footsteps. The children's heads snapped toward the ceiling in unison. She's coming, the girl whispered. Claire stumbled back into the narrow passage, slamming the hidden door shut behind her. Her flashlight flickered as she scrambled up the stone steps, her heart hammering in her chest. The footsteps above were growing louder, heavier. The sound wasn't hurried. It was deliberate, patient, like someone walking with purpose. When Claire emerged back into the matron's office, the room was colder. The portrait of Eleanor Gray seemed to stare directly at her, the edges of the frame coated in frost. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. Claire's breath caught. She reached for the doorknob and slowly turned it, peeking out into the hallway. The corridor was empty, but the air felt wrong, heavy. Claire could see her breath fogging in front of her as she stepped out into the hallway, every instinct in her body screaming at her to turn back. "Miss Claire?" The voice came from behind her, soft, right by her ear. "Nah." She spun around, her flashlight illuminating nothing but an empty hallway. But something had changed. The wallpaper was cracked and peeling, frost creeping across the walls in jagged patterns. And down at the far end of the hallway stood a figure. It was tall, shrouded in heavy, dark fabric. A bonnet framed a face that was pale and expressionless, its mouth twisted into something between a smile and a grimace. It was Matron Eleanor Gray. Claire stumbled backward as the figure of Eleanor began gliding down the hallway, her movements impossibly smooth, her feet never touching the ground. "You shouldn't be here, Miss Claire," Eleanor said, her voice cold and sharp, like glass scraping against stone. Claire turned and ran. The hallway twisted and stretched as though the building itself was shifting around her. Doorways led to dead ends, staircases spiraled into darkness, and the faint sound of children crying filled the air. At last, Claire burst into what had once been the dining hall. Long wooden tables stood covered in frost, the chairs scattered as if abandoned in a hurry. Her flashlight beam flickered over the far end of the room and froze. A single child sat at the head of the long dining table. A girl, no older than 7, her dark hair hanging limply over her pale face. She was staring directly at Claire, her hollow eyes glistening in the faint light. "You can't leave," the girl whispered. "She won't let you." Claire's breath hitched as she took a cautious step forward. "Why? Why is she keeping you here?" The girl's lips trembled. "Because she's afraid." A loud crash erupted behind Claire as the doors to the dining hall slammed shut. The room plunged into darkness as her flashlight sputtered out. Somewhere in the pitch-black room, Claire heard Eleanor's voice. "You shouldn't have come here, Miss Claire." Claire ran her hands across the table, trying to find her way in the dark. Her fingers brushed against something cold and wet, frost spreading across the wooden surface. The sound of Eleanor's footsteps echoed around the room, slow and deliberate. Then, somewhere nearby, a child's whisper. "The chapel. You have to go to the chapel." Claire's heart pounded. She turned and bolted toward the nearest window, her shoulder colliding with the glass. It shattered outward, and she tumbled into the snow below. The freezing cold bit into her skin as she pushed herself to her feet. Above her, Eleanor's face appeared in the broken window. Her hollow eyes locked onto Claire as frost began to spread across the glass shards. "The chapel," Claire muttered to herself. "I have to find the chapel." She turned and ran through the snow, the orphanage looming behind her like a stone giant cloaked in shadow. Somewhere deep in the storm, the faint toll of a bell echoed through the night. The chapel was waiting. Claire staggered through the snow, the icy wind slicing against her exposed skin. The orphanage loomed behind her, its dark silhouette partially obscured by swirling flakes. Every crunch of her boots in the snow was accompanied by faint whispers carried on the wind. "The chapel! The chapel!" The tolling bell grew louder as she stumbled forward, her flashlight flickering weakly in her trembling hand. Up ahead, she could make out the faint outline of the chapel, a smaller stone structure standing against the storm, its pointed spire barely visible against the gray sky. The chapel doors were ajar, swaying slightly in the wind. Claire pushed them open, stepping inside with a shiver. The interior was dimly lit by the faint glow of dusty stained glass windows. Wooden pews, cracked and warped, lined the room. At the far end stood an altar covered in a tattered white cloth, and behind it loomed an imposing stone cross, partially hidden in the shadows. But it wasn't the altar that caught Claire's attention. It was the children. They stood scattered throughout the pews, silent, still, their hollow eyes turned toward her. They were faint, translucent, as though made of frost and shadow. At the center of the group stood the girl with the braid and the teddy bear. Her glassy eyes met Claire's, and her voice echoed faintly across the chapel. "You shouldn't have run, Miss Claire. She doesn't like it when they run." Claire took a cautious step forward, her breath visible in the cold air. "Why is she doing this? Why won't she let you leave?" The girl clutched her teddy bear tightly. "Because she's afraid of being forgotten, afraid of being alone." Another child, a boy with a cracked wooden train, spoke up. "She promised to keep us safe. But the snow wouldn't stop. The sickness wouldn't stop." Claire's chest tightened. "She locked you in, didn't she? She trapped you here." The children nodded in unison, their pale faces expressionless. The girl with the teddy bear stepped closer. "There's a way to end it, Miss Claire. A way to set us free." Claire's voice trembled. "How?" The girl glanced toward the altar. "The matron's book. It's hidden beneath the altar. It holds the truth." Claire stepped toward the altar, her boots echoing on the stone floor. The children's eyes followed her, their hollow gazes reflecting the faint light. With trembling hands, she lifted the tattered cloth covering the altar. Beneath it was a small, leather-bound book, its cover etched with strange symbols and dark stains. She opened it carefully, the brittle pages crackling under her touch. The ink was smeared in places, but one passage stood out. "The children are mine now. The sickness was mercy compared to what waits in the snow. They cry, they beg, but they cannot leave. The forest listens, it watches, and it will take everything if the doors are opened again." Claire's pulse quickened. The forest, the snow, the sickness, it was all connected. A faint whisper echoed from behind her. "She's here." The chapel doors slammed shut with a deafening boom. The stained glass windows cracked, spider webs of frost spreading across them. Claire spun around, clutching the matron's book to her chest. Eleanor Gray stood at the entrance, her bonnet casting a shadow over her pale, hollow face. Frost crept across the stone floor beneath her feet, her long gown dragging across the ice as she stepped forward. "You meddle in things you cannot understand, Miss Claire," Eleanor said, her voice sharp and brittle like breaking glass. The children in the pews turned their heads in unison to face the matron, their hollow eyes wide with fear. "You locked them away," Claire said, her voice trembling but resolute. "You let them die here. You let them suffer." Eleanor's lips curled into a cruel smile. They were already doomed. The snow was relentless, the sickness unstoppable. But here, in these halls, they are safe. They are mine. Claire stepped back, clutching the book tightly. "You have to let them go. You have to end this." Eleanor's eyes glowed faintly beneath her bonnet, two pinpricks of pale light. "No one leaves Blackridge, Miss Claire. Not the children. Not you." With a flick of her wrist, the lanterns lining the chapel walls shattered, plunging the room into darkness. Chaos erupted. The children screamed, their faint forms scattering like mist as the shadows came alive. Claire stumbled backward, the matron's book clutched to her chest as frost spread across the floor and walls. The matron advanced slowly, her hollow eyes glowing in the dark. "You should have stayed away," she hissed, her voice echoing unnaturally. Claire's flashlight sputtered, casting fleeting beams of light across the chapel. She spotted a side door near the altar and bolted toward it, her boots skidding on the icy floor. The door flew open, and Claire spilled out into a narrow hallway. The air was colder here, the frost creeping across the walls and ceiling like veins of glass. The children's whispers followed her. "She's coming. Hurry, Miss Claire. Don't stop." Claire sprinted down the hallway, her breath coming in sharp gasps. The shadows twisted and shifted along the walls, Eleanor's faint voice echoing somewhere behind her. You cannot run from me, Miss Claire. At the end of the hallway, Claire spotted a heavy wooden door, frosted over, its edges glowing faintly with pale light. She slammed her shoulder into it, the wood splintering as she forced her way through. He stumbled into a circular room, smaller than the chapel, but lined with tall, stained glass windows. In the center stood a stone pedestal, and atop it rested something that glowed faintly. A lantern, its flame frozen in ice. Claire's eyes widened. This had to be it. The heart of the orphanage's curse. The final anchor binding Eleanor to this place. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a cacophony of desperate voices. The lantern. You have to break it. End it, Miss Claire. Set us free. The door behind her slammed shut, and Claire spun around to see Eleanor standing there. The matron's face was a mask of fury, her hollow eyes blazing with pale light. You will not take them from me, Eleanor shrieked. The shadows surged forward, clawing at Claire as she reached for the lantern. Her fingers closed around its frozen handle, the ice biting into her skin. Please, let them go, Claire screamed. The matron lunged forward, her outstretched hand inches from Claire's face. With a final, desperate cry, Claire hurled the lantern to the ground. It shattered into 1,000 shards of light, and an explosion of warmth and golden radiance flooded the room. Eleanor let out a piercing scream as her form began to dissolve, her edges crumbling into frost and ash. The shadows retreated, the whispers faded, and the light consumed everything. When the light dimmed, Claire was on her knees, gasping for breath. The frost had melted from the walls, and sunlight poured through the cracked stained glass windows. The air felt still, peaceful. Around her, faint silhouettes of children stood in the light, their hollow eyes now filled with something softer, something human. The girl with the teddy bear stepped forward. Thank you, Miss Claire. One by one, the children faded into the light, their forms drifting away like smoke on the wind. The orphanage was silent again, but it wasn't empty. The golden light from the shattered lantern faded slowly, leaving the circular room bathed in cold sunlight filtering through the cracked stained glass windows. Claire knelt on the icy floor, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Her trembling fingers released the broken shards of the lantern's frozen glass, now scattered around her like fragments of lost hope. The oppressive weight of the orphanage, the whispers, the shadows, the cold, felt lighter. The air wasn't biting, the silence wasn't suffocating, but it wasn't over. Somewhere deep within the building, a sound reverberated through the frozen walls, a long, low groan, like the very stones of Blackridge were exhaling after centuries of holding their breath. Claire stood up, her legs weak and shaking beneath her. Is it done? She whispered to herself. But then she heard it. Thump, thump, thump. Heavy footsteps echoed from somewhere far below. They were slow, deliberate, and impossibly loud, resonating through the stone like the heartbeat of the orphanage itself. No, Claire muttered, backing away from the door. It's not over. The shadows in the corners of the room began to shift again, stretching unnaturally toward her. The faint chill of frost started creeping back over the floor. Whatever she had done, it wasn't finished. Claire stumbled back into the narrow hallway, clutching the tattered journal she had taken from the chapel. The lantern was broken, but something was still binding the orphanage, keeping the darkness alive. The journal's brittle pages crackled as she flipped through them, her flashlight beam trembling over the ink-stained words. The sickness came with the snow. It consumed the children slowly, cruelly. I tried to protect them, but the forest, the cold, they demanded more. The lantern could not hold back the hunger forever. Only one final act can end it. A return to the beginning, to the root of it all. The root. The beginning. Claire's eyes scanned the page until they landed on a single word scrawled over and over again, growing more frantic with each repetition. The nursery. She sucked in a sharp breath. Of course, the place where it all started, where the children had once been safe, before everything went so horribly wrong. The hallway twisted in on itself as Claire stumbled through the orphanage, following faded signs carved into wooden plaques: dormitories, infirmary, nursery. The deeper she went, the colder the air became. The frost returned, spreading like veins across the wallpaper and seeping into the wood. The voices followed her now, whispering her name, begging her to turn back. Claire, don't go. She's waiting. The door to the nursery stood at the end of a narrow corridor. Its faded white paint was chipped and peeling, and a small brass plaque read, "Nursery authorized personnel only." The door was ajar, swinging slightly in an unseen breeze. Claire stepped forward and pushed it open. The nursery was frozen in time. Rows of tiny wooden cribs stood silent and still, covered in frost and cobwebs. Ragged curtains hung limply over frost-crusted windows, their edges fluttering faintly in the cold draft. The air smelled stale, heavy with mildew and something else, something faintly metallic. Toys lay scattered across the floor, their colors faded by time and frost, but at the center of the room, bathed in a faint flickering light, stood Matron Eleanor Gray. Her tall, skeletal figure was cloaked in heavy fabric, her bonnet framing her pale, hollow face. Her hands were clasped in front of her, long and thin, with frost spreading from her fingertips. She turned her head slowly, her glassy eyes locking onto Claire. "You shouldn't have come here," she said softly. Claire tightened her grip on the journal, her voice trembling. "It's over, Eleanor. The lantern is gone. The children are free." Eleanor's lips pulled back into something that resembled a smile, but it was wrong, twisted, predatory. "You think you freed them?" she hissed. "You've only unshackled me." The air in the nursery changed. The frost on the cribs crackled, the shadows in the corners deepened, and the faint sound of children crying echoed through the walls. Eleanor lifted one skeletal hand, and the frost on the floor erupted upward, icy shards forming into jagged spikes that spread toward Claire. Claire dove to the side, her shoulder slamming into one of the cribs. She scrambled backward, clutching the journal as Eleanor advanced. "You think you understand this place, Miss Claire?" Eleanor said, her voice sharp as broken glass. "But you don't. This orphanage is mine. These children are mine." "No," Claire said, her voice steadying. "They were never yours. You locked them away. You let them die." Eleanor froze, her pale lips trembling with something that almost looked like guilt. For a brief moment, the frost stopped spreading. "The nursery?" Claire said, her voice soft now. "This is where it started, isn't it? This is where you made your choice." Eleanor's hollow eyes seemed to flicker, her figure trembling as if caught between two worlds. "I wanted to save them," she whispered. "But the snow wouldn't stop. The sickness wouldn't stop. The forest, it was hungry." Claire stepped closer. "But it's over now, Eleanor. Let them go. Let yourself go." The shadows around Eleanor began to shift and ripple, the frost on the floor slowly retreating. But then, a sharp, childlike scream erupted from the corner of the nursery. "No!" A figure stepped out of the shadows, a small child, a girl with long dark hair and hollow eyes, the same girl Claire had seen in the dining hall. "She can't leave," the girl said, her voice cold and brittle. "We need her. She keeps us safe." Eleanor turned toward the girl, her face crumbling into sorrow. "No, I tried." The shadows surged again, spreading outward like black smoke. The frost crackled as it reclaimed the floor. Eleanor screamed as her form began to unravel, her edges disintegrating into shards of ice and shadow. "No! Stop!" the child wailed, her hollow eyes filled with panic. But it was too late. The shadows retreated into the walls, the frost shattered like glass, and the air grew still. Eleanor Gray was gone. The nursery was silent now. The frost had melted, the toys lay still, and the faint light from the windows bathed the room in pale gold. The child with the hollow eyes stood frozen in place, staring at where Eleanor had been moments ago. She's gone," the child whispered. Claire knelt down, her voice gentle. You're free now. You don't have to stay here anymore. The child's lip trembled, her hollow eyes slowly filling with tears. But where do we go now? Claire's chest tightened and she reached out, her hand hovering near the girl's cold cheek. You go where the light is, Claire said softly. You go where it's warm. You go home. The girl nodded slowly, and one by one, faint silhouettes began to rise from the cribs. The translucent forms of children drifted upward, their pale faces finally at peace. The light in the nursery grew brighter, warmer, until Claire had to shield her eyes. When she opened them again, the nursery was empty. The nursery was silent. The frost had melted, the shadows had retreated, and the pale, golden light of dawn spilled through the cracked, stained glass windows. Claire stood in the middle of the room, her shoulders sagging, her breath forming faint clouds in the cool air. It was over. The children were gone. Their translucent forms had drifted into the light, their whispers fading into the warmth. Matron Eleanor Gray had been consumed by her own guilt in the darkness she had unleashed. But the orphanage still stood. Its bones creaked faintly in the wind, its halls stretched out into cold silence. Claire let out a shuddering breath and clutched the tattered journal to her chest. She needed to leave. The hallways were no longer twisting and suffocating. The frost was gone, and the windows let in pale daylight that felt weak but real. Claire's boots echoed on the wooden floors as she made her way back through the orphanage. In the grand dining hall, the tables were still overturned, toys and debris scattered across the floor. But the oppressive cold had lifted. In the playroom, the rocking horse stood still. Its wooden eyes no longer felt like they were watching her. When Claire finally reached the grand entrance hall, she stopped. The massive wooden doors stood slightly ajar, letting in slivers of pale light and the scent of fresh, clean snow. She stepped outside. The storm had passed. The sky was a pale shade of blue, and the snow on the ground sparkled in the morning sunlight. The frozen trees that surrounded Blackridge stood still and quiet, their skeletal branches no longer seeming to claw at the sky. Claire turned back to look at the orphanage one last time. Its dark silhouette stood solemn against the snowy landscape, silent, still, watching. She let out a sigh, her breath forming a delicate mist in the cold air. It's over, she whispered, but deep in her chest, she knew something still lingered. Claire's car was buried under a layer of snow, but the engine sputtered to life after a few agonizing tries. She turned the heater on full blast and sat back in the driver's seat, her hands trembling against the steering wheel. She stared at the orphanage through the windshield, the windows of the building now empty, the shadows no longer shifting behind the glass. As she pulled away, the orphanage slowly disappeared in her rearview mirror, swallowed by the snow-covered pines. It was 3 days before Claire finally returned to civilization. A small mountain town, warm lights glowing from cozy cottages, and the sound of life humming faintly in the distance. She checked into a small inn, her body aching, her mind numb. She placed the matron's journal on the nightstand and stared at it. The leather was cracked, the ink smeared in places, but its words still carried weight. A story of guilt, loss, and desperate choices. Claire considered burning it, throwing it into the fireplace, and letting the flames consume the weight of what had happened. But she couldn't. Instead, she opened it one last time. The final entry stared back at her in thin, shaky handwriting. The snow cannot be stopped. The forest always hungers. But love is what kept them here. I tried to save them. I failed. May they find peace in the light. Claire closed the book. Months passed. Claire returned home, but Blackridge never truly left her. She dreamt of frost-covered hallways, the distant sound of children's laughter, and the sharp, hollow voice of Matron Eleanor Gray. She pored over the journal night after night, trying to piece together the fragments of the tragedy that had unfolded in the orphanage. But some questions would never have answers. One evening, while sitting at her desk with the journal open beside her, Claire received a letter. It was written in careful, childlike handwriting. "Thank you, Miss Claire. We're safe now. We found the light. But the snow is still falling. Keep the lanterns lit. S." Claire's blood ran cold. She looked out her window, and for a brief moment she thought she saw it, the faint outline of frost creeping along the edge of the glass. Claire returned to Blackridge Orphanage one final time. It was spring, and the snow had melted from the mountains. The road was clear, and the sky was bright and cloudless. But the orphanage remained unchanged, frozen in time, dark and silent against the backdrop of vibrant greenery. She pushed open the rusted iron gates and stepped into the courtyard. The cherub statues still stood, their hollow eyes watching her with a kind of quiet sadness. Inside, the orphanage felt different. The frost was gone, the shadows still, but the silence was heavy. Claire made her way to the nursery, her footsteps echoing faintly through the halls. When she entered, the sunlight was streaming through the cracked stained glass windows. The cribs were empty, the toys scattered and lifeless. But one object sat neatly in the center of the room, a lantern, polished and pristine, with a small, flickering flame inside. Claire approached it cautiously, her breath caught in her throat. The flame danced softly, casting a faint golden glow on the stone floor. She reached out, her hand hovering over the glass. A faint voice echoed in the room, soft and childlike. "Don't let it go out, Miss Claire. The snow is always watching." Claire stepped back, her chest tight. She left the lantern burning, its faint golden glow filling the empty nursery. Outside, the wind had picked up again. The clouds rolled in, and the faintest dusting of snow began to fall from the sky. Claire stood at the gates of Blackridge Orphanage one last time. She knew the truth now. The orphanage would never truly be free, not entirely. But for now, the children were safe. For now, the lantern was lit. Claire turned and walked away, her footprints the only marks in the fresh snow. And behind her, in the highest window of the orphanage, a faint golden light flickered, waiting, watching.